Okay, everyone, I'm looking at part two of our Eisenhower Cold War foreign policy description. Some of the things that have been addressed so far were primarily the Hungarian Revolution, also the role of Sputnik. This becomes, really significant because the United States in 1958 and in 1959 really puts forth a good amount of effort to create the National Defense of Education Act. This is in particular where we see this huge balloon in spending for STEM education. Prior to this, science was not necessarily the hot topic that everybody was studying in school. Throughout the late 50s, there's a lot more interest in STEM courses. There's also at the college level a great amount of increase in funding for things like engineering programs, and a lot of this is also going to connect to what becomes federal programs, including NASA, for example, which is all about creating, a program for space exploration. We see, under the next administration, the Kennedy administration, for example, the announcement that the United States will go to the moon. But NASA's really created under Eisenhower, and it is a reaction to the Soviet success early on. There's a great deal of Soviet emphasis on their space program, and it is, immediately successful. And there are opportunities that the United States has, and it takes a while for the United States program to really become as sophisticated. And so NASA, we see this huge effort, and some of this is also going to connect with missiles. So, whereas early in the Eisenhower administration, a lot of the funds go to bombers, that are going to carry weaponry to places far away, missile technology, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ways in which guided, missiles that are able to go longer distances and whatnot, that is going to become the significant, thing that becomes developed during the later 50s. And of course, we know that Eisenhower does have a covert program really focused on spying on the Soviet Union's technology, taking pictures, for example, of where the Soviets are at with their missile production. By 1960, this is at the very end of the Eisenhower administration, there is a shot down U-2 plane. The pilot is actually captured. Gary Powers is captured by the Soviets, and Eisenhower doesn't realize that and tries to cover up the fact that the United States was spying. He suggests it was a plane that was, out of its range. It was like a weather plane or something like that. And then Khrushchev comes forth not only with the plane, but with the captured pilot. So the United States is kind of caught in the act of being a little bit covert, and that creates a great deal of tensions between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, toward the end of the Eisenhower administration. Another really big theme throughout the time period of the 1950s is really this broader theme of decolonization. There's a great deal of rhetoric after 1945 and the end of World War II to tone down some of the colonization that had occurred. And as we see kind of the map here, you can look at places on the map in Africa, for example, Mali or Algeria or Rwanda, Zambia. Throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, we see throughout Africa a pushing out of the colonial powers with the intent to have more nationalist, movements on the ground, and ultimately independence movements. And so lots and lots of these independent societies that are kind of new, right? And we see it in Asia as well, Burma, India, Pakistan, Laos, Vietnam, some of these areas where there's clearly like a shedding of the colonial power or pushes to do that lend themselves now to becoming part of the Cold War framework. And there's like a competition to some degree between the United States and the Soviet Union to compete with each other for influence in some of these newly decolonized places. And so a big place where the Cold War moves in 1950 are places throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The Middle East also becomes a place that's kind of open in a sense for some degree of sphere of influence. And we see see that becoming the framework for some of the case studies that you all have in class, is an interest that the United States might have in places like Iran, for example, or Egypt, and some of these nationalist movements that get attached in some ways to communism, either because they ally with the Soviet Union or because they're outright Marxist, creates ways in which for the United States to kind of accept some nationalist movements but not others, based on their relationship to communism. So there's kind of this larger framework that as societies are becoming independent, they're kind of falling to what the U.S. Perceives as either the Soviet sphere or the U.S. sphere, and the U.S. sphere to U.S. policymakers is the better, choice. And the more there is a Soviet sphere domination, the U.S. policymakers are fearing that as largely Soviet expansion. It kind of fits under the George Kennan framework of, the fact that there's this hostile power that's looking to expand. And for people that buy that, even in the mid-1950s, they're seeing a lot of the dynamics on the ground as less about independence movements or nationalism, perceiving it as attached to communism. So Eisenhower is going to heartily use the CIA, which is new at this time. It is kind of created as an organization that is geared toward intelligence collecting, but also using the CIA to get on the ground within certain societies and kind of influence, to undermine communist governments or perhaps to install pro-U.S. regimes. So there's actual U.S. efforts to control the political systems within some of the societies that we're looking at. Okay, an example of that is Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax is largely where the CIA helps to overthrow an elected Iranian government. Mossadegh is the person in charge, and he had made efforts to basically nationalize oil companies, including some companies that were British, and there is a great kind of outcry. How could he do this? Because now it doesn't give the European powers, a chance to make money, off of the oil and have access to it. So the United States kind of gets involved in this and ultimately kind of arranges for Mossadegh to be marginalized and the Shah of Iran to come into power. This becomes significant because many people in Iran will see the Shah as a pahlavi, to become a brutal dictator. And the relationship between the Shah of Iran and the United States becomes very significant. There will actually be an opportunity for not only European powers, but also the United States to actually have a connection to some of the oil and in Iran. So there's some arrangement, and that's one of the case studies that somebody in class is looking at. In 1956, we also see the leader of Egypt, who is Nasser. He is kind of got an interest in making, in a sense, a pan-Arabic movement. So creating not only within Egypt, but with other Middle Eastern societies. Some of this is kind of connected to the relation of Israel, because Israel is kind of a new country. Some of the Arabic countries reject, in a sense, the legitimacy of Israel as a largely, Jewish state. So there become tensions, in the region. Nasser is actually in a position to be angry at the United States for not funding a dam project that Nasser is looking to have on the Nile River. And as an outgrowth of that lack of funding, Nasser will look to seize the Suez Canal, which is really significant canal. It enables European powers to kind of easily move goods into the area kind of in closer to India and the Indian Ocean, kind of south of Saudi Arabia. The Suez Canal is crucial for France and for England, and they are largely using and abusing it. When Nasser controls it, it becomes an issue between England, France, Israel, and also the United States. And a lot of what people will be looking at the group in the Suez crisis is what's the U.S. role in what becomes a very challenging issue that is led in some cases by Egypt, but also a response that's led by England, France, and Israel, and not the United States. Kind of how and in what way does that case study speak to U.S. power? Okay, sorry, I'm gonna go back for a second. Sorry, the Eisenhower Doctrine does come about at the later part of the period, which is really very similar to the Truman Doctrine. So, on some levels, Eisenhower doesn't come across as very different than Truman, especially regarding the Middle East. He does have economic and military aid. Rather to Greece and Turkey, he is encouraging economic and military aid to any country in the Middle East threatened by communism. So I guess rather than saying, it's more Eisenhower is extending the Truman Doctrine to the Middle East. Okay, that's the better way to look at it. And OPEC is formed as a response to this in 1960. It's basically an official cartel, countries that set oil prices in conjunction with each other and act, as a cartel, which would be illegal within some countries. In Latin America, we also see a great deal of intervention from the United States in 1954, the year after the CIA is involved in Iran. It's also involved in Guatemala. There is what is perceived to be a leftist government, a Marxist government, and some Marxism kind of screams communism to the United States. And there is a way in which the United States CIA gets involved in overthrowing the leftist government for another government, and kind of the outgrowth of that particular issue is what happens in Guatemala, has huge impact on local politics in Guatemala. And also we see in Cuba. Cuba had a particular leader that was fairly authoritarian, known as Batista. There is huge efforts even before 1959 and 1960 to try to reform some of the policies for the Batista regime. And there's a internal revolution within Cuba. The Cuban Revolution is led largely from the inside, and Fidel Castro is one of the significant players. When Castro becomes the leader of Cuba after the revolution, he's not only kind of inspired to lead the revolution, he also serves as kind of the new government, in which case he's going to follow a model based on communism, and he's going to nationalize a great deal of Cuba. This is a very big difference, because there had been a lot of American businesses that were largely using parts of Cuba as a playground of sorts. There was a great deal of business presence from American businesses, and it becomes Cuban and nationalized by the Cuban government. And Eisenhower is going to respond to some of Castro's policies. He will do a variety of things, one which will be because Cuba is about 90 miles from the United States, will order an embargo, and also we see Cuba moving closer to the Soviet Union. Some of this will have huge impacts later on. Kennedy, under the Kennedy administration, we actually see Kennedy employ what is an Eisenhower developed plan to actually have Cuban exiles and Cuban revolutionaries in Cuba actually counter Castro, and the U.S. Kind of looks to support that particular mission. That does not happen under Eisenhower, but the plan gets written under Eisenhower. So there's some efforts within the CIA to develop kind of proposals for the ousting of Fidel Castro, and these plans go rather far. So we'll leave it up to the Cuban group to develop that a little bit further, okay, in terms of looking at that particular case study. This will also serve as kind of precedent for what happens in the early 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union and Cuba ultimately will see some Soviet missiles aimed at the United States in the location of Cuba. Much of this has to do with the kind of brewing and new power of Fidel Castro, so he's somebody to kind of get a handle on. There are other things as well. There are things in, other parts of the Middle East or whichever, but these are some of the biggest issues, and I think it addresses mostly what everyone in class is considering, okay? If you have questions about any of this, let me know, but just to give you a sense of some of the key topics, okay? I think that is it for our time, so I'll end there.